Hey guys, welcome to BP the Bible Perspective. Let's discuss 3 reasons pastors cover and hide their sins. 3 reasons. Now, before we get into it, let me say this, that because as you can see, these pictures here showcase are some of the most famous and well-known pastors, past and present. So I do realize that there are a lot of people that will get angry and upset when you showcase their well-beloved, uh, where highly esteemed pastors. Now, I am going to do a video as to why their followers, okay, um, cover and hide their sins and accept what they do, even when they know that they're doing it. That it doesn't matter. I'm gonna do a video on that as well. But for now, I want to just talk about why these pastors themselves go to great lengths to cover and hide their sin. Now, what you see here is what they all have in common is that in one way, even though they're different denominational backgrounds, okay, but they all have in common that their sin has disgraced them, and in some cases, they've been removed from office, pastoral offices, okay. Now, one other thing too is I want to say this, that I'm not being judgmental on them. In other words, this is not casting shade, as they say, because as the saying goes, there but by the grace of God, we all could be there. In other words, they have access to stuff that the common person doesn't. They're in the public, so when their sin is exposed, the world knows it. When our sins are exposed, really people sometimes don't know, or very few. The point is that we all come short. And we all need the mercy of God, and thank God through Jesus that mercy is poured out abundantly. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't discuss their sin, the hypocrisy, because they continue to do it if we don't. And as I said, this is a representation of past and present famous pastors. And this is just by no means all. This is just a small fraction. If I really wanted to dig into the pastors and the ministries who have, but they represent, again, the same reasons why they hide and cover their sins. Now, there are basically 3 reasons I'm going to cover: shame, preservation, and evil. A lot of them are ashamed to admit they have fallen. Some, and I'm going to say that this is probably one of the most common reasons, is preservations. For one reason or another, they seek to hide their sin for the preservation of their ministries. And the other is just plain evil. Just plain evil. Okay, just plain evil. And we'll get to that. We should also know that this is not anything new, right? In other words, throughout history, pastors have fallen, they have sinned, and one of the most famous, and the reason why this is famous, is King David. And remember King David, and just to, again, he is the greatest king that Israel ever had. David was so great that God said about him that he is a man after my own heart. Now just let that sink in for a moment. When God says you are a man after my own heart, that's heavy. David is mentioned with the very bloodline of Jesus. The very throne of Jesus is compared as an analogy to like an earthly type of Jesus. The preservation of the David's throne and the generations to come. In other words, he is even said prophetically to come and to reign in Israel. So David's got some weight here. But he was also flawed. And one of his greatest flaws was his affair with Bathsheba. And what makes this affair so very interesting. Now, Bathsheba was one of the most beautiful women, and people interject a lot of stuff about this. But one time, one spring, when the armies went out to war, David stayed back. One night he went on his balcony, and there was Bathsheba bathing. Right now, some people would say that she was tempting him. That's conjecture, but it is interesting. At any rate, he was inflamed with his lust, and he sent for Bathsheba, slept with her. And like a lot of men, see, they got that hit it and quit it kind of thing. In other words, man, wouldn't it be nice if I just find a woman I can just hit and quit and go on? But, there's that fatal attraction kind of thing, right? That Glenn Close, right? I will not be ignored. Great movie, by the way, that scared the bejeebies of a lot of men. Doesn't stop adultery, but it does make you think. Well, David, in a sense, probably kind of had the same kind of thought. I'm just going to hit this and quit this. Beautiful women, because remember, this is David. He has access to a lot of beautiful women. The problem is that Bathsheba got pregnant. And David, for whatever reason, probably shame, and as I'm guessing, sought to cover this sin. And I don't know why he thought this. So now enter Uriah. Uriah was Bathsheba's husband. Now the other thing about Uriah, he was a faithful soldier. We'll get back to that in a moment because that's important. Uriah was also one of David's 30 mighty warriors. In other words, you had to accomplish some good feats to even make the list. There were people who were good, but they never made that list. Well, Uriah made that list, and he was a faithful soldier. God had blessed him with a beautiful wife. Unfortunately, of course, the wife didn't return that. Well, David, in an attempt to cover his sin, he sends for Uriah, pull him off of the battlefield, tried to entice him, got him drunk, and then said, hey man, go home to that beautiful wife of yours. But Uriah was faithful. And in his mind, he thought, well, I can't do that. Well, while my brothers are out fighting, I'm not going to go and live it up with my wife. Even though she is fine, I'm not going to live it up with her. Well, David, realizing that it was not going to happen, even though I don't know why he ever thought that was going to work anyway. Did he not know that people would look at that child and go, that's not Uriah? And besides the fact, already around the palace, people knew what David had done. But anyway, what David did was he decided, since, okay, I cannot get him to go home and sleep with his fine wife, David writes a letter and sealed it up and sends it by the hand of Uriah to Joab. Now, of all people, Joab, one of the most wicked military commanders, which just happened to be David's nephew, his sister's son, but wicked. Of all the people you want to disgrace yourself with, David sends Uriah. And what Uriah did not realize, because he was faithful, in other words, he didn't peek in and read the letter. He was faithful, and he was punished for his faithfulness. He's carrying his death warrant. And that's the tragedy here. He gets the letter, he hands it to Joab. I can imagine Joab reading this letter. He's reading it, and he looks at Uriah. And the letter said, hey, when you're in the heat of the battle, put Uriah out front and then withdraw from him. And that's what Joab did. And Uriah was killed. And of course, God punished David for that. You see, he sought to cover him with the great lengths to cover. I'm not for sure why either. He was king, like I say, probably shame and disgrace. Now, the same then with a lot of these pastors, they have their various reasons why they have sought to cover their sins. Let's look at a few of them. One of the persons you see here is, let's talk about Martin Luther King first, because again, he's probably one of the most revered. And you may go, well, why would I dare to impeach or to disparage Martin Luther King? Well, he was a great leader. Of course, the I Have a Dream speech, leader of the modern day civil rights movement, which caused the nation to ever change through his effort and the efforts of the people around him. Of course, he changed the history of America. Not only the history of America, but also of the world. This man is known and respected around the world. But what was also little known at the time, and now even more so coming out, that Martin Luther King was an adulterer. Now you may ask, well, why would they seek to cover this? Because, of course, many of the public didn't know until after his death. A lot of the people then knew, and certainly the FBI knew, he was an adulterer, a serial adulterer. In other words, when he was out on the road marching for civil rights, when he would come home to the motel, he was jumping into bed with women. So why did they seek to cover? Well, not shame necessarily, and not evil, but preservation. Many of them thought, let's cover it for the sake of the movement. Now, does God, in a sense, care about that? No, as we saw with David, God exposed David. But anyway, that's one of the reasons why they did with Martin Luther King. Now, the other guy that you see here, Ted Haggard, many of you may know him. Ted Haggard was one of the, he had a large church in Colorado Springs, but more so, he was the leader of the National Association of Evangelicals, and at the time, 30 million members, a very large voting bloc. But Ted got into, and his struggle was with homosexuality, and he got caught up with a gay male prostitute slash masseuse, as they call it. And he was buying meth and having his gay relationships with this man until the man outed him. He then he lied to the very end. I mean, Ted absolutely lied. People had, look, we got the evidence, and he still lied to his wife, lied to his church. So why did Ted cover up? Well, again, same reasons. I would say, first and foremost, shame. And secondly, preservation. He wanted to preserve his lifestyle, his position, okay? Now you have, come to the other side here, Paul Crouch. Now, Paul Crouch is the founder of the largest Christian network in the world, TBN. And towards the end of his life, probably among many other things, but one of the things that kind of got him outed, they had to kind of retire him, was he got involved with an ex inmate, and I guess they began to pay this inmate a couple $100,000 to keep him quiet. But then the inmate got greedy, wanted $400,000. And at that point, the gig was up. But again, why did they go through an expensive way to cover it up? Well, one, preservation. Wasn't even shame to me, but preservation. In other words, we have a ministry, and there's a lot of money coming in through this ministry. As I said, it is the largest Christian television network. Now, the next guy is the late Marcus Lamb, founder of Daystar Television, the second largest television network. A few years back, he was caught up in an affair. And what was interesting about this was that his employees found out about it, and they wanted to sue Daystar because to them they said, well, we was misled because we thought this was a Christian atmosphere, a moral atmosphere. But of course, like a lot of things, they probably got a little too greedy. And then Marcus sat with his wife, right, and said, "Hey, I have sinned," and kind of squashed that. Now, the one thing that's always interesting about wealthy people in money, you can only go so far with it, and they will go down with the ship, taking the money with them. Okay. All right. So our next group here. Let's start with Brian Houston. Now, Brian Houston is founder of Hillsong. If you, I think they only got. I believe they also have their own channel. The Hillsong Church has sprung up about 20 years ago, and now you see that they're all over the world. Based, I think, in Australia. But what's amazing about this ministry is that you got like what he pastors is these locations. They're in several locations around the world. But we're talking about these huge 20, 30,000 seat stadiums. Well, he got caught up in an affair and was kind of outed, okay, and had to leave his office. Now this guy, Carl Letts is an American Hillsong pastor, so coming up under Brian Houston. But Carl Letts is famous because of a lot of the celebrities that follow him. Probably one of the most prominent is Justin Bieber. And again, got caught up in an affair. What's interesting about this was that none of these guys that we're talking about, in a sense, ever came forward and say, hey, I've sinned. In other words, they were always outed. Why? Preservation. The preservation. Now, Zachary Timms, the late Zachary Timms, the pastor out of Florida. He had a very interesting path. I'm going to come back. I'm going to show you the connection he has in a moment with Paula White. Zachary Timms had a large church in Florida, and he got caught up in drugs and an affair. He was flying to Paris, okay, to carry on an affair with a stripper in Paris that caught up with him, and he had his troubles. Sadly, he passed away what is believed to be a drug overdose. Now, what is interesting about this, that his family, I think still to this day, seek to not have that particular news come out about him. In other words, they basically try to not, they don't want to say that he died of a drug overdose. And again, why? Preservation, not just shame, but preservation. And when I say preservation, the preservation of the ministry. In other words, these are large ministries bringing in a lot of money. So a lot of people benefit financially for the preservation of these ministries. Now, Bob Corey is interesting. He is a Calvary Chapel pastor, or was, who got caught up in an affair. And I'm going to come, there's another Calvary Chapel pastor I'm going to talk about later. But he ended up resigning his pastoral position at his church. Okay. All right. Now, Kat Carr is a false prophetess. She has many false prophecy under her belt. Some of the most notable ones, she's mostly time featured on the Kenneth Copeland television network. But most notably, many times she has prophesied that Trump was going to have a second term, he was going to win. All these prophecies have come, have failed. Okay. Paula White. Now, Paula White is very interesting. She was Trump's spiritual advisor. They started a church in Florida. She has been, I think, married at least 3 times. Also had numerous affairs, one of which is with Benny Hinn, as you see there. I'll come back to Benny later. Also that's interesting is that she has taken over Zachary Timms' church. Now remember him? Zachary Timms, after his passing, their church, for whatever reason, hired or let Pastor Paula White take over the reins. Again, this warp preservation for money's sake. I'm also going to attach evil unto this. Now remember, I said that there were three reasons: shame, preservation, and evil. Well, I'm attaching evil unto this too because they knowingly mislead and deceive God's people. Now, Jim Bakker, during the 80s, probably 70s, but mostly the 80s, was one of the highest watch television networks. The PTL Club. He had an affair with one of the secretaries, and that's what caused his demise. He also ended up going to jail for fraud and a whole bunch of other stuff. But again, they sought to cover their sins because what? We need to preserve the money, preserve the ministry. Jimmy Swaggart has also a television network today. And of course, what was interesting about Jimmy Swaggart was the one who exposed and got Jim Bakker ousted. Both were the Assemblies of God. Now, at the same time, there was a little less known minister by the name of Marvin Goldman that Jimmy Swaggart got ousted too, again for adultery, his sexual sins. But Marvin Gorman, his name, he was not too happy with Jimmy and sought revenge, which he got one of the sweetest of revenge that result in this picture as you see with these crying tears. Marvin hired a private investigator to follow Jimmy, and payday happened when the investigator saw Jimmy going into a motel with a prostitute. He calls up Marvin and says, "You better get down here." Marvin flies down to the motel and catches Jimmy coming out and go, "I got you now. Yes, I got you now." Okay. And in this, one of the most tearful repentance here, Jimmy says, "I have sinned." Okay. And then later would be caught again in the same sin. Caught up with just a prostitute. Okay, the ultimate hypocrite here. Ravi Zacharias. Now, Ravi Zacharias was one of the most famous apologists around. And interesting enough is that his scandal really didn't come until after his death, where several women came forward and said that he molested them, almost to the point of rape. But it's interesting that his family right now doing what? Preservation. Because you know what? His tapes and his books and his lectures, they still sell them. Okay, so they go through. They were forced to admit his sin. All right, Jack Lowe and Jack Sapp. John Lowe and Jack Sapp, both Indiana pastors, fallen over adultery. Jack Sapp actually was the pastor of I think the First Baptist Church in Hammond. I don't know, it might have been first, second, or third, one of those two. But in Hammond, that church occupies a whole square block of downtown Hammond, Indiana. So if you're ever in Hammond, Indiana, you almost go by his church going to the casino that's in Hammond. At the time, they also had a large Sunday school. When I say large, they would go as far as 70 miles to bus people in for the Sunday school. He got in trouble because he got involved with an underage girl. Took her across the line. I think he's still in prison. Eddie Long, of course, pastors New Birth Church. He was the pastor of New Birth Church in Atlanta. Got caught. Several men came forward and accused him of having affairs, grooming and having affairs with him, homosexual affairs. He denied it to the end. And again, why? Not because of shame, but preservation. Jamal Bryant, now by the way, Eddie Long passed away. I don't know if it was cancer or something like that, but he has since passed away. And the church hires Jamal Bryant. Now, Jamal Bryant, his father, I believe, is president of I want to say AMA denomination, or one of these big churches, district or something like that. In other words, he's come from a family of ministers, but he is coming to New Birth. He came with baggage, numerous affairs, and now he is in pastor of the New Birth church. Okay, weird to me. All right. Now, the two pastors on the end, Mark Driscoll and James McDonald, very interesting pastors because they didn't fall because of sexual sins. They fell because they were accused of being very abusive, pastors, and also greed. And so, of course, they were trying to preserve their ministry for the money's sake and a lot of other stuff. Now, this guy Lonnie Frisbee in the middle. Now, you got to go back into the 60s and the 70s. Lonnie Frisbee was probably one of the at the beginning of what is known as the Calvary Chapel ministry. Now, if you remember, I said that Bob Coy, if you remember this guy, Bob Coy, I said he was a Calvary Chapel pastor. Well, Lonnie Frisbee was right there at the very beginning. The Calvary Chapel movement started in the 60s by the late Chuck Smith. And it was the churches that were known by their verse-by-verse teaching through the entire Bible. Very, very well known. Very acquainted with the Calvary Chapel pastors. Okay, I was a part of those churches. Okay, but anyway, Lonnie Frisbee got caught up he was really known to be a flaming homosexual. And what was interesting about the Calvary Chapel movement is that they continually covered up his known sin. Okay, and not exactly known. I don't know exactly why they covered it up either. It wasn't necessarily for the preservation of the Calvary Chapel movement, but for some reason they did cover up his sin. Now, Benny Hinn, and I'm putting a lot of these three because, well, let me start with Jim Jones. Jim Jones, of course, is known for the largest mass suicide in history. He was a false prophet, a false pastor, who just was a drug addict, all kinds of sexual sins. Not only homosexuality, but also women, young children. And in the end, he led his congregation to commit suicide. Now, this is where one of the phrases "drink the Kool-Aid" come from, because they had these large batches of Kool-Aid. What is interesting about Jim Jones is he was an atheist. Now, let that sink in. Now, Benny Hinn, the reason why I'm kind of highlighting him because I don't have any respect for Benny Hinn. Fake healer. He has been caught up in some affairs. One with Paula White. Remember her? Paula White. That was one of the sins, adultery, he was caught up in. And why did he cover it up? Again, the preservation of the ministry. Jerry and Becky Falwell. Now, of course, they make the honorable mention here as being the only couple because Jerry Falwell is the son of Jerry Falwell. His name is Jerry Falwell Jr. His father is Jerry Falwell Sr. And he is during the 60s and 70s, going into the 80s, one of the founders, you can say the architects of the Christian right. He had the moral majority. You could say he was very responsible for corralling the votes, getting people like Reagan elected. But his son, the apples, definitely fell far from the father, because upon Jerry Falwell's death, the kingdom was divided between two sons. One son got the church, a large church, Thomas Road Baptist Church, while Jerry got the university. And of course, Liberty University is known because Jerry Falwell got caught up in scandal after scandal after scandal. One of which some pictures of his wife, Becky. They were known as also hard taskmasters, but also they said that Becky kind of likes a lot of the students. And in one of the most proverbial ways, not proverbial, but in one of the things that almost like cliches, right? She got into an affair with the pool boy at a hotel. And that was one that led to some of the downfall. Even after these things came out, they still wasn't falling. Why? Preservation, and also, I'm going to say evil. He was a staunch supporter of Donald Trump, but that might have been because of blackmail, because the pictures of the pool boy, Trump's henchman lawyer, got a hold of him and basically was like, we got the pictures, you're going to support Trump, okay? One of the things that was the kind of thing that got him really outed from the ministry is that there were some pictures that came up with Jerry and some students, some girls, with their pants unzipped, okay? In other words, the story goes, they were just freaky all over the place, okay? All over the place. So again, what is always interesting is why did they cover up their sins? Why did these ministers cover up their sins? Shame, preservation, and then evil, guys. And as I said, why do people follow them? That's in our next video. All right, guys, look. Share this video, and also your comments are welcome. So add them. I will see you in the next video.